Welcome back to Classic Books Deep Dive. I'm Michael.
And I'm Joanna.
And we're diving into Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. If you want to grab a copy of the book, you can find a link in the episode description.
Yes, definitely.
Now, Harari throws down a gauntlet right from the start.
He does.
He asks us to confront a pretty unsettling possibility. What if the end of history we all talked about after the fall of the Soviet Union, what if that was just like a temporary pause?
Yeah, it's a provocative question to kick things off, for sure.
Yeah.
Harari argues that the grand narratives of the 20th century, fascism, communism,
Right.
they may have crumbled, but that doesn't mean liberalism is automatically like the winner, you know,
Right, yeah.
in some historical sense.
Yeah, and he doesn't just throw out a theoretical challenge. He points to very real events like Brexit and the rise of nationalist leaders, some even in democratic countries,
Yeah.
as signs that this victory lap of liberalism might be premature.
Yeah.
What do you make of that connection?
Well, what's fascinating is how Harari uses those current events not just as like headlines,
Right.
but as symptoms of a deeper disillusionment.
Right.
He argues that as the promises of globalization haven't worked out equally for everyone, people are losing faith in these large-scale systems, and so they're looking for more localized solutions, even if that seems kind of impossible in our interconnected world.
So if the big systems are failing, where does that leave us as individuals trying to make sense of it all? Harari dives into one area that I think everyone is anxious about, the future of work.
Oh, yeah. And he does not sugarcoat it.
No.
Harari argues that the combination of infotech and biotech could lead to mass unemployment
Wow.
on a scale we haven't seen before. And he's not just talking about like factory jobs being replaced by robots.
Right.
This goes way deeper.
Okay. Now you've got to give us some specifics here. What does he see happening that's so different this time?
Well, his point is that AI and automation aren't just like doing manual labor anymore. They're moving into fields that we thought were uniquely human.
Okay.
So he uses examples like AI making medical diagnoses that are more accurate than human doctors, or even composing music
Wow.
that people find more emotionally engaging than human-created music.
So it's not just about being outcompeted physically, but potentially intellectually and even creatively.
Yes.
That's unsettling, to say the least.
Yeah.
Does Harari offer any way out of this potential crisis?
Well, he explores ideas like universal basic income,
Right.
which has been discussed a lot lately in the real world, too.
Yeah.
But he doesn't just present it as like a magical solution.
Right.
He's very clear-eyed about the challenges. Like,
Yeah.
how do you fund it? How do you prevent massive social unrest when a huge portion of the population feels economically useless?
Yeah.
It's not a simple answer.
And speaking of things that feel unsettling, his chapter on liberty and data is a real eye-opener.
It is.
It's one thing to worry about AI taking our jobs.
Right.
But what about AI taking our freedom?
That's one of the most thought-provoking parts of the book, for sure. Harari argues that in this age of big data, our very concept of individual liberty is under threat.
Okay.
And he paints a pretty stark picture of what he calls digital dictatorships.
Okay, break that down for us. What does he mean by digital dictatorship? Is this like some supercomputer in charge of everything?
It's more subtle and in some ways scarier than that.
Yeah.
He argues that algorithms are getting so good at understanding us, at predicting and even manipulating our emotions and choices,
Right.
that we might end up living in systems where we're being controlled without even realizing it.
So it's less about some like evil overlords and more about losing control without being aware of it.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be a slow creeping kind of loss of freedom.
Totally. And Harari points out that this wouldn't necessarily be like some dramatic coup.
Right.
It could happen gradually with governments and corporations using our data to kind of nudge us towards certain behaviors, certain choices, all in the name of efficiency or even our own well-being.
The question is, where do we draw the line between helpful guidance and manipulation? It makes you wonder, in a world where data is constantly being collected and analyzed, how much agency do we really have is free will, just an illusion in the digital age?
Right.
And speaking of digital connections, he also tackles the idea of community in a very interesting way.
Yeah, he challenges the assumption that online platforms are automatically building strong, resilient communities.
Okay.
He uses the example of what would happen if a dictator suddenly shut down the internet in a country.
Right.
Would those online groups survive?
Wow.
Would they be able to organize resistance offline?
It's a question I hadn't really considered before, but we tend to think of the internet as this vast, ungovernable space.
Right.
But in reality, it's very dependent on infrastructure
Yes.
and vulnerable to those in power.
Absolutely.
So what's his take on what makes for a real community then?
Well, he argues that real communities have to exist beyond the virtual realm. They need face-to-face interaction. They need shared experiences.
And a sense of belonging that goes deeper than just liking the same posts or being part of the same online group. He seems to be suggesting that those digital bonds are important, but they can't replace the kind of connection that happens when people are physically present with each other, working together towards common goals.
So it's not about abandoning the digital world entirely,
Right.
but recognizing its limits and making sure that our online interactions are grounded in real-world connections.
Yes.
It's making me think differently about how I spend my time online, that's for sure. And it's interesting how Harari links these very digital age concerns to something we often think of as very traditional religion.
Yes, he argues that while traditional religions might not offer practical solutions to the technical and policy problems of the 20th, they still hold immense power in shaping identity. And that power can be used for good or for ill.
Give us an example of what he means by that.
Well, he dives into the example of state Shinto in Japan.
A religious tradition that was used to bolster nationalism and even inspire kamikaze pilots during World War II.
Wow.
It's a chilling example of how religion can be manipulated for political ends.
It's a sobering reminder that these ancient forces are still very much at play in the modern world, and it raises some really important questions. Can religious traditions adapt to the challenges of a globalized, technologically advanced world, or will they continue to be used to justify violence and division?
Those are questions we all need to grapple with, and Harari doesn't let us off the hook easily. He challenges us to confront what he calls the knowledge illusion.
Okay, what is the knowledge illusion and why should we care?
It's the tendency we all have to overestimate our understanding of the world.
Right.
Especially as it gets more and more complex. We live in an age of information overload, and we often mistake access to information for actual knowledge. And Harari argues that this illusion can be incredibly dangerous.
How so?
Well, think about it. If we believe we understand something when we really don't, we're more likely to make bad decisions, to fall for propaganda, to be manipulated by those in power.
So it's not just about being uninformed. It's about being overconfident in our limited understanding. That's a really subtle point, but it feels incredibly relevant in the age of fake news and all the misinformation out there.
Exactly. Harari suggests that we need to cultivate intellectual humility.
Okay.
To be willing to admit what we don't know and to be open to changing our minds when presented with new evidence.
It's about being critical thinkers, not just passive consumers of information.
Yeah.
And that ties into his critique of empathy, right? He argues that empathy alone isn't enough to build a just world.
Yes, and this is where things get really challenging. He acknowledges that empathy is important, but he argues that our ability to empathize is limited. We can easily empathize with people who are similar to us, but it's much harder to truly understand the experiences of those who are vastly different.
He uses a very specific example that really hit home for me. He talks about how an African-American man who has undoubtedly faced discrimination himself might still struggle to fully empathize with the unique challenges faced by an African-American woman or a Chinese lesbian.
It's a powerful example that highlights the limits of empathy. Even when we have good intentions, our own experiences can blind us to the suffering of others. So if empathy isn't enough, what else do we need?
That's the question, isn't it? And it leads us into another really fascinating part of the book, his exploration of the post-truth era.
Harari argues that humans are storytelling animals and we're wired to believe in narratives even when those narratives are demonstrably false. He draws a parallel between religion and fake news, suggesting that both rely on the power of repetition and emotional appeal to create shared beliefs.
It's a chilling thought, especially given how easily misinformation spreads in the digital age. We're constantly bombarded with competing narratives, and it can be incredibly difficult to discern truth from fiction.
Harari argues that we need to develop a critical eye, to be aware of how stories are being used to manipulate us, and to be willing to challenge narratives that don't align with reality.
It's about becoming discerning readers of the world, not just passive recipients of information.
Yeah.
So what's the takeaway here? In a world of bewildering complexity, where old stories are crumbling and new narratives are constantly emerging, How do we make sense of it all? How do we find meaning and purpose? Harari surprisingly offers a very personal reflection on the importance of meditation.
He describes meditation not as an escape from reality, but as a tool for understanding the workings of our own minds. He suggests it can help us cultivate mental flexibility, emotional resilience, and a deeper appreciation for the present moment.
Right.
Qualities I think we can all agree that seem essential for navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
It's an unexpected but intriguing suggestion. It speaks to a larger theme in the book, the need for individual reflection and self-awareness.
Absolutely. Harari doesn't offer easy answers.
Right.
But he does provide a framework for understanding the complexities of our time. He encourages us to confront difficult questions, challenge our assumptions, and cultivate the mental and emotional tools we need to thrive in an uncertain world. It's almost like he's saying that in order to grapple with these huge external forces, we need to turn inward first. We need to understand our own minds before we can even understand the world.
That makes sense. It's easy to get swept up in the chaos and uncertainty of everything that's happening around us.
Right.
But maybe taking a step back, developing that inner resilience can help us to see things more clearly.
And that's where this idea of the knowledge illusion comes back. And Harari isn't saying we shouldn't try to learn or understand things. Right. It's more about being aware of the limits of our knowledge and being cautious about mistaking information for true understanding.
I'm thinking about how many times I've scrolled through social media and felt like I was learning so much, but then later realized I couldn't really explain the issues or form a solid opinion. It's like we get caught in this cycle of consuming information without truly digesting it.
Exactly. And that makes us vulnerable to manipulation.
Okay.
Because if we think we already know everything, we're less likely to question what we're being told.
Right.
To seek out alternative viewpoints or to engage in critical thinking.
So how do we break out of that cycle? What does Harari suggest we do to cultivate this mental flexibility he talks about?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of being open to new information, even when it challenges our existing beliefs.
Right.
It's about being willing to change our minds, to admit when we're wrong.
Yeah.
And to constantly be learning and evolving.
That sounds like a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where everyone seems so entrenched in their own opinions.
Right.
It feels like we're constantly being told to pick a side, to dig in our heels and defend our position no matter what.
Harari acknowledges that, and he doesn't shy away from the difficulty. He argues that true mental flexibility requires a certain level of humility. It means acknowledging that we don't have all the answers.
That our perspective is limited and that there's always more to learn.
It's almost like he's saying we need to be more comfortable with uncertainty, with not having everything figured out.
Yes.
But doesn't that go against our natural desire to find certainty, to feel like we're in control?
It definitely goes against the grain of our culture, which often rewards confidence and certainty over humility and self-doubt.
Right.
But Harari argues that embracing uncertainty is essential for navigating the complexities of the 21st century.
So how do we do that? How do we cultivate this kind of intellectual humility?
He suggests actively seeking out diverse viewpoints, engaging in respectful dialogue with people who hold different beliefs, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions. It's about stepping outside of our echo chambers and exposing ourselves to different ways of thinking.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more nuanced, more balanced approach to understanding the world.
Yes.
It's not about blindly accepting everything we hear, nor is it about clinging to our own beliefs no matter what.
It's about being open, curious, and willing to engage with complexity.
And that requires emotional resilience.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, engaging with different perspectives can be uncomfortable.
Right.
It can challenge our sense of self, expose our biases, and even make us feel angry or defensive.
He talks about the role of meditation in developing this resilience, right?
He does.
I have to admit, when I first read that part, it felt a little out of left field. Like, what does meditation have to do with solving the world's problems?
It might seem like a strange connection at first, but when you think about it, it makes sense.
Okay.
Harari isn't suggesting that meditation is some magical cure-all. He's saying it can help us develop the mental and emotional tools we need to navigate difficult conversations, process challenging information, and respond to stress and uncertainty with more calm and clarity.
So it's not about escaping from the world. It's about equipping ourselves to engage with it in a more mindful, more compassionate way. It's about finding that inner stillness amidst the chaos so we can make wiser choices, both for ourselves and for the world around us.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really crucial point that Harari makes throughout the book, the interconnectedness of everything. He argues that we're not just individuals operating in isolation.
Right.
We're part of a larger system, a global community, and our choices have ripple effects far beyond ourselves.
So it's not just about personal growth or self-improvement. It's about recognizing our responsibility to each other and to the planet as a whole. But how do we reconcile that with the reality of a world that feels so divided, so polarized? He talks a lot about the dangers of nationalism, of retreating into our own tribes, of losing sight of our shared humanity.
He's warning us against what he calls us versus them thinking, this tendency to see the world in black and white, good versus evil. He argues that this kind of thinking leads to conflict, to division, and ultimately to undermining our ability to address the global challenges we face.
So how do we break out of these patterns? How do we cultivate a more global, more inclusive perspective?
Harari doesn't offer a simple solution, but he does point to some potential paths forward.
Okay.
He emphasizes the importance of education, of critical thinking, of cultivating a sense of shared responsibility for the fate of the planet. He seems to be suggesting that we need to move beyond nationalistic thinking.
Right.
To recognize that we're all part of a single interconnected global community.
That's a powerful vision, but also a daunting one.
It is.
It requires a shift in consciousness, a willingness to see beyond our own immediate self-interest, to embrace a more expansive, more compassionate view of the world.
And that brings us back to Harari's point about meditation.
Right.
He's not saying that meditation is a panacea for all the world's problems, but he does believe it can help us cultivate the qualities we need to navigate these challenges with greater wisdom, compassion, and resilience.
It's about quieting the noise of the external world, connecting with our own inner wisdom, and cultivating a sense of stillness and clarity amidst the chaos.
Yes.
It's about finding that space within ourselves where we can connect with our shared humanity, where we can access the compassion and the courage to face the future with open hearts and open minds.
It's a powerful invitation, isn't it?
Yeah.
An invitation to step into a new way of being, a new way of relating to ourselves, to each other, and to the world around us.
And it's an invitation we all need to consider, especially as we face the unprecedented challenges and possibilities of the 21st century. It really does feel like a call to action, like Harari's asking us to step up and take responsibility for the future, not just sit back and wait for things to happen.
And it's not about waiting for some grand solution to appear or for someone else to fix everything. He's very clear that change starts with individual choices, with each of us making conscious decisions about how we live, what we consume, how we interact with the world.
He uses the example of climate change, which we've all heard so much about, but it can feel so overwhelming, He says even seemingly small choices like what we eat, how we travel, what we buy, when multiplied by billions of people, can actually shift the course of events.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not powerless. We have agency and our actions have consequences. It's like he's saying, don't underestimate the power of your daily choices to shape the future for good or for bad.
And that brings us back to that idea that humans are storytellers, which we touched on earlier. Harari argues that the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we collectively believe in have a huge impact on how we behave and what kind of future we create.
He draws this really interesting parallel between ancient myths and modern-day fake news. Okay. He's not saying they're the same thing, but he points out that both rely on repetition, emotional appeal, and this desire to belong to a group that shares the same beliefs.
So it's about being aware of how narratives, whether they're ancient myths or viral tweets, can be used to manipulate us, and more importantly, how we can become more discerning about which stories we choose to believe.
He gives the example of how, for centuries, stories about different races or nationalities were used to justify colonialism and oppression. These were powerful narratives that shaped people's worldviews, and they led to real-world suffering.
So it's not just about intellectual curiosity. It's about understanding how stories can be used to justify injustice, and how we need to be vigilant about challenging those harmful narratives.
Exactly. And it connects back to his point about empathy.
Right.
If we only listen to stories that reinforce our existing worldview, if we only empathize with people who are like us, then we're going to miss out on a huge part of the human experience.
Yeah.
And we're going to be ill-equipped to create a truly just and equitable world.
So how do we ensure that the stories we choose to believe in are grounded in truth, in compassion, and in a vision of a better future for all?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And Harari doesn't offer a simple formula. He suggests that we need to cultivate a discerning mind, a critical eye, a willingness to question even our most deeply held beliefs.
He talks about seeking out diverse perspectives, engaging in a respectful dialogue, and being willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence. It's about being open, curious, and humble in our approach to understanding the world.
And he also emphasizes the importance of connecting with our own inner wisdom, with that place within ourselves that resonates with truth, with compassion, with a yearning for a more just and sustainable world.
He suggests practices like meditation can help us access that inner wisdom, to quiet the noise of the external world, to cultivate the clarity and courage to follow our own inner compass.
It's about trusting our own intuition, our own sense of what's right, what's true, what's possible. It's about recognizing that each of us has the potential to be storytellers, to create narratives that inspire, that uplift, that point the way toward a more beautiful and more just future.
And it's about remembering that the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we share with others, have the power to shape the world we live in, for better or for worse. So as we wrap up this deep dive into 21 lessons for the 21st century, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we're not just passive passengers on this ride. The future is uncertain, yes, but it's also ours to create.
Harari leaves us with a lot of questions, but he also gives us a framework for thinking about those questions and for taking action. He reminds us that even in a world of immense challenges, we still have agency, we still have choices to make.
And those choices, however small they may seem, can have a ripple effect far beyond ourselves. What stories will you choose to believe and what narratives will you help to shape?
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to think differently about the world and your place in it.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What questions or insights did this book raise for you? Share your reflections in the comments below. Until next time, happy reading.